evening. Welcome to the Black Doctoral Network weekly web series. I'm your moderator, Fessa Ilonge, and I am thrilled that you could join us for Conversation Starters, another wonderful topic entitled The Modernization of Higher Education. Joining me this evening are three wonderful panelists that will share their insights and help us understand how modernization impacts the higher education sector. The first panelist joining us this evening is Dr. Anika Simone Johnson, who currently is a Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Warner School of Education and Human Development at the University of Rochester. Her research entails first-generation college students, identity, minorities, financial literacy, mentorship, wellness management, imposter syndrome, safe zone, LGBTQ and A+, ally and unconscious and implicit bias. I welcome you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. The second panelist joining us this evening is Dr. Liana Hippolyte, who is the Assistant Professor at Cal Poly Pomona in the Department of Educational Leadership. Her research interests entail organizational change, use of technology towards advancing educational equity. She also conducts qualitative research focused on changing material outcomes for racially and economically minoritized students. I welcome you, Dr. Hippolyte.
Thank you.
And our third panelist joining us this evening is Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon, who currently is the director at the Black Students Center, also assistant professor in the African American and Diaspora Department at the University of Wyoming. As an educator, historian, and community advocate, his career entails providing successful pathways for the most at-risk students towards access, matriculation, and with the ultimate goal of graduation. I welcome you, Dr. Douglass.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Good evening.
All right. So I want to go ahead and jump right in to the first question on the agenda, which is, how would you describe the relationship between modernization and higher education? Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thinking about this question, it really had me think of higher education and this modernization as a relationship, a slow dating relationship. And the reason why I say that, it's a phase, and higher ed, in my experience, is slow. It takes a long time for change, to implement new policies and procedures. And as technology is turning around rapidly, we have diverse learners who are learning differently. It is a struggle, in my experience. There's some conflict, and not everyone is ready to move quickly when we are thinking of incorporating new technology for better learning styles of our students, as well as learning within staff as we're trying to bring in different professional development opportunities. So it's very slow. There has to be someone at the table advocating and pushing continuously. And I am one of those people at my institution where I'm working.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Dixon, what are your thoughts?
I think it's an A+ question and a great way to get started. And I really appreciate the comments. So when I think about modernization of higher education, then as a historian, it's very difficult to begin in the contemporary without understanding the past. So when we begin to talk about modernization of higher education, then we need to have a complete or clear understanding of what higher education has been historically and traditionally. Higher education, in many ways, has been a space where only some could access higher education. If we go back to those Harvards and those kind of inceptions of higher education that were for all white men under the cloth of some sort of religion. And now we think how that has changed and the modernization of that. Well, some of those stalwart, or what we call those fundamental principles, still lie. in the modernization of higher education. So looking at a couple of spaces, right around 1800, Thomas Jefferson and the connection with the University of Virginia began to introduce student affairs or student rights. So we see this tradition and how it changes. And then we think about fast forwarding to the late 1960s, and we see Black Power show up on college campuses. And we understand that the very first Black Power, Black Study Center is created in 1969, San Francisco State, under the leadership of the great Black sociologist, Dr. Nathan Hare. So we see these transition pieces. And now, right now with modernization, as was well said by my colleague, it's ever changing, it's ever evolving. But one of the things that it does have, it has the propensity and the flexibility to wash certain people out of success. So with modernization, I think it's really accurate that we look to what higher education does, who it serves, and how it serves them. So modernization of higher education, particularly now, is going to be somewhat of a past connection to those things that were important. And a lot of times those things that have been important in higher education has been this iconic whiteness, to look at higher education as a space for white men to dominate. So I think the modernization now today, it's beginning to change because we see different diverse groups being injected into the equation. Although slowly, we do see some of these changes happening. And I mean, we want to be sure that we look at it for solutions. And one of the solutions to this modernization and how technology has played the role is we get to see things in real time. And we get to have a critique of those things by many different people in one space, just like we're doing here today. So the modernization of higher education, although it's ongoing, it still represents the stalwarts of the past.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Dixon, for that explanation and breaking it down like that. What about Dr. Hippolyte? What are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think what my colleagues did beautifully is summarize where higher ed has been in the past and where we are right now. And I've been thinking a lot about the future of higher education, and particularly the interest of capitalism and privatization on higher ed. So what we believe for so long, despite all of its very fair criticisms, is that higher ed was supposed to be a public good, provide something for our society beyond its doors, conduct research that would have import beyond the university. And I think because of particular private funds, foundations, and their influence on the kinds of research that are conducted, and perhaps the implications of the studies that are done, as well as decreases in public funding of our institutions, we'll continue to see these exacerbations in terms of opportunity and access to our institutions. And though a positive, I would say, of modernization in terms of COVID and the transition to virtual instruction has been that some of our students who are working, who have families, who are just managing a lot on their plate, this is a potential area for access and opportunity. And at the same time, I'm worried as we think about this return to in-person learning, if there's going to be even more of a separation between the kinds of higher ed experiences that certain students are able to have. So what I mean when I say that is it going to be even more the case that our most privileged economically and racially, those students are able to have the traditional live on campus, develop as a human being, explore academic opportunities in all of these unique ways, and that fewer of our racially and economically minoritized students are going to be able to access that kind of a higher ed experience and instead opt for virtual learning, which for all of its benefits may also shortchange them in what some of the added gains can be from attending college.
Oh, thank you very much. And I love how everyone has their own insight in how you all are answering this question. And this is why I wanted this to be the first question so everyone can see how broad and in depth of a topic this is. So thank you all for your insight. So the next question that I have is, how does modernization impact academic achievement? Dr. Dixon.
I think it's direct and specific. when I think about how we begin to internalize our information. Mentioned very well about online learning, but we didn't talk about much of the digital divide in that online learning, which we know is a problematic issue in higher ed. I think even with the term diversity, equity, and inclusion in modernization of higher education, that it's become a catchphrase. I think the idea of social justice advocacy has become a catchphrase because it's systematically set up to have this control over institutions. And we mean not just a broad stroke, but everywhere, that we find the control of these institutions, particularly we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, those particular spaces that I've seen in my experience has been that when we have people who have the power over those hiring committees, those people who have higher over tenure and promotion, those people who have power over funding and the distribution of resources. And it's in many ways very challenging for someone who doesn't understand the systemic impediments and has this ability to connect with students. We find them to be very valuable to the institution in only certain ways. And the institution begins to be part and parcel what's important. But if we go backwards, we begin to see the importance if we critically examine how, these industries have become the topic of discussion and become more well-funded. But yet and still, we still have these divisions and these cleavages in these graduation rates and acceptance rates. So modernization with this question, modernization in itself represents the growth of higher ed, but it also allows for us to give critical critiques of those things that have become what many people believe are the most problematic issues in higher education.
No, thank you, Dr. Dixon. Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Thinking about this question, how does modernization impact academic achievement? I'm always thinking about the different ways that we have to assess our students, how we have to assess our different programs, how we have to assess the different work that we're doing. And that changes over time. It changes year to year. And as we're moving through this new technology, I'm thinking specifically in this COVID space and academic achievement, it has been extremely difficult for many students that I know at my institution, where they're not even sure where they're standing academically, because in terms of their academic achievement, right? Well, I'm looking at my syllabus. I think I'm submitting everything I need to submit, but there's not that back and forth dialogue and communication with faculty and instructors to really say, yes, you are completing this work. A lot of work is not giving back. It's really devastating, I believe, because students are not really sure where they stand. We have to think about this fatigue when we're on Zoom. And not only are we in Zoom with classes, we have to submit things online. And it's a lot for students. And then we're thinking of different disciplines. So instructors have to come up with new ways, if they haven't already, before COVID, but now during COVID, to really facilitate instruction that can be difficult. Some know how to do it, some don't want to do it, and they have to. So I think it's impacting academic achievement significantly, because students are not really sure where they are. And if they are doing well, that's great. But my eyes always go to the students that are struggling, who don't have access, those who are probably decided to stay home and not have this campus experience. So it's been really, in my opinion, challenging and difficult. And I'm thinking more of students of color, because that's the population, students that I'm always working with. So it's been, I would just say it's been really challenging. And students as well as instructors have to find different ways to measure success. And they have to think broadly opposed to linear, how they probably have done before, and using different mediums. So students can really learn in different types of ways, not just reading something, but what type of video are we showing? How are we communicating through, I'm using Blackboard, for example, the dialogue back and forth that students are having that can really show that there is learning happening and that the student can display that they are definitely receiving the learning that's supposed to be received, and how is that being measured can be a little difficult. But nevertheless, I do think it's impacting academic achievement in a significant way.
No, thank you, Dr. Johnson. I like how you added the applicability of within the context of COVID-19. So a lot of our audience members can really understand that. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. And Dr. Hippolyte, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Again, just want to amplify all of the insights from my colleagues. I'm a former college counselor, so I work both on the high school side, helping students apply to college, but then also as a college advisor. And so that work is very near and dear to me and taught me so much about what our young people need in order to be successful and haven't been historically given because of our oppressive systems. And I think so much to the prior points that have been said of that has been really extended because of the onset of this global pandemic. And it makes me think about a few data points around the fact that we've seen lower FAFSA completion, the financial form that you need in order to access being able to pay for higher education. There's also some recent data that came out about lower application rates of Black students applying to college at the undergraduate level. That's really concerning. And then we know on the K-12 side that there are thousands of students who have just gone off the map. Their principals haven't been able to find them, their teachers can't find them. And because of so much of that digital divide that was mentioned in terms of access to internet, stable housing, stable access to food, and being able to care for one's family and one's community, that we are just seeing the beginnings of the implications of this pandemic on academic achievement for our young people. And I'm sure, like many of us share in our perspective, that if you are to take a real equity lens, then we would direct more resources to our young people and our communities and our families that need us most at this time. I'm not convinced that that's happened. I think even just about the pods, the small spaces where small groups were getting together for extra tutoring or support from educators, that even that ended up being another way of kind of opportunity hoarding within this really volatile moment of this pandemic. So I hope that we're not only offering kind of all of these terrible things that are happening, but at the same time bringing light to the fact that these are the realities of our young people, and that it's going to require a lot of work. And particularly, I think our young people are looking for relationships. They want to see their teachers, they want to see their friends, they want to feel like they're in that social cohesive community. And we need to find ways to return to that in a safe way. Because we also know how racially minoritized communities were most impacted by this pandemic as well. So there's a lot on our plate, but I feel like there are so many educators who are really passionate about making sure we can best support our students.
No, thank you very much. I mean, I'm just loving the responses you all are giving to these questions, and I want to reach out to the audience members. If you are enjoying this conversation, please feel free to like, comment, ask any questions to our expert panelists. They'll be more than happy to answer them. So moving on to the next question that I have is, how important is e-learning in curriculum development? Dr. Johnson.
You know, that's a big question. I mean, we have to unpack that. How important? Yeah. Okay. It's of course it's important, right? Because we have to use technology. We should be using technology, but it still brings me back to how do you structure a course that students are getting everything that they need from the course? What are the outcomes of the course? What are we looking at that students need to walk away from the course with? When we think of e-learning, right? That's really important. This is a student is supposed to learn and get everything from this particular curriculum that's online. Sometimes students need that communication. Is there things built into this course that you can still talk with a professor, maybe at the end of a module or beginning a new module? There needs to be some communication. How are students reflecting from navigating from module to module? Is there a quiz at the end to show that they're learning? Do they get to take the quiz several times until they get the right score? Because a lot of modules give you that opportunity. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's a heavy question, loaded, but in my experience, even taking an online course, which I recently completed, I enjoyed it, but I had to watch like 2 hours of a video before I can move on to the next quiz. The flexibility is great. But really, am I engaged? What does that look like? You need to provide resources. So not just a video, but now there needs to be content of resources that I can refer back to. And how long do I have this video that I can access? So, yes, it's important. And yes, we need to cater to our different learning styles of students, for sure. And those are the different things that we have to think about. That's a lot of layers there that I just mentioned. I'm sure I'm missing a few more. But we are moving into new times now, right? COVID-19 really showed us something a little bit different, that you can learn from home, you can work from home. So we have to move with the times and provide those options for our learners. So that way they have the ability and the flexibility to actually take these e-learning opportunities to move them through whatever particular program that they are a part of.
No, thank you, Dr. Johnson. You did a wonderful job at unpacking that question. So thank you. Dr. Dixon, what are your thoughts?
E-learning is essential. It is as fundamental to higher education and education itself as it is to say hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet for Americans. So to think about e-learning, I think it's really what COVID has done is forced some folks to get off the sidelines, to become active, to become part of the conversation. And I think that's a great thing. And I don't think that if you struggle in the classroom connecting with your students face to face, that you become this great teacher through e-learning. So there are layers and they are very nuanced. But one thing we can understand that teaching our youth today, and I say that as a middle-aged man, that it becomes very important that if you want to understand what young folks are thinking, understand what they're listening to. So if they're listening to you as the teacher, then you have to make those very fundamental connections that allows for you to tap into their brilliance, which it is there. And if e-learning is what is forced upon us as the medium to do that, I think it has it goes like a seesaw. There are great things about e-learning that I love greatly, like the chat board and things of that nature, just to further engage. But there is something about this face-to-face contact for me as an instructor that, when I raise my voice, there's a little difference in me being a little bit more methodical. So I think one thing is done. It has forced the instructors to get in line, if you will. It has forced the administrators to become a bit more cognizant of those disparities that we see, particularly if we're going to be critical with each other, and we should be, as long as we do it out of love and for the good of the group and not the individual. That, a lot of us, particularly, now this has nothing to do with anybody personally, but those folks who have secured tenure for years, who believe that they should put their feet up now. That was ruined by COVID because they had to, like James Brown said, had to get on the good foot. They had to become part of this conversation where it challenged them. Now, I've been teaching online off and on for years, so it's not a big deal to me, but I need to always be abreast of what's coming next or how I can best use something in my classroom that is not a part of it right now. So I think e-learning puts us all, it's very similar to having a Fortune 500 company and you remove everybody's title. And we all start at a point, for the most part, where it's more of an even playing ground, particularly for those who have never tried it before. So I think, there's a ayat from the Holy Quran that reads, a reminder always benefits the believer. And e-learning is the believer. It is the reminder that allows for us to go back and not just reset, but get better at those things that challenge us the most. So I think e-learning, when it comes to where we are now, it's essential, it's challenging, but it has a way of bringing us all together as a way of improvement. So I enjoy e-learning. And right now, I have to be honest with you, I'm a little nervous about going back into a classroom with 60 people. It's just the reality of e-learning. I'm not comfortable, but that's something that I'm going to deal with. I even taught last semester face-to-face because I wanted to deal with it. So now as we move forward with e-learning, I think one of the most important parts of it is how can it make us better as those who forward information? Well, we had problems forwarding esoteric information before e-learning. So e-learning indeed kind of strengthens the status quo because it is the modus operandi. So e-learning does give us a platform to challenge and grow.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dixon. And I love how you spoke to the collective aspect of it, bringing us together. So that's very important. Thank you. Dr. Hippolyte.
So I actually started my current position at Cal Poly Pomona during the pandemic. So my introduction to teaching education doctorate students, EDD students, was through virtual learning. And so I had to learn a lot about platforms and how best to engage. And there were a few strategies that I feel like really helped. And obviously being aware of Zoom fatigue was one of them. So finding ways where we could go into small breakout groups and people could go cameras off and I would always tell them, find a cozy spot and maybe print something out and take some time to read it or do some reflective writing, keeping all my lectures to just a few minutes. Knowing that it's really hard already. It's not a great pedagogical practice, but can be more helpful when it's in little bits and chunks and mixed in with some hands-on efforts. Just like our young people, our professionals are feeling many of the same desires for social connectivity. So I found that also my students just needed time to check in with one another, see how they were doing. Obviously, many of my students work in K-12 and higher ed as teachers and administrators. And for them, they were also dealing with not just the education of their children and their family members, but their students and their spaces. And so I found that at the heart of all of it was really still being committed to relationship building. And while it looked different than traditional in-person approaches, having consistent office hours, creating a space where students could come in to cry, to talk, to explore ideas ended up being extremely important. I didn't think people would have the time to come in, but then I realized how important it was to just have a space to release because everyone feels so overwhelmed and stressed with what's been happening over the last year. Yeah, so I would say the relationship piece and then also bringing in some pedagogical practices that could be translated into the virtual space to support students have really been important, and I think will continue to be important if we move forward with some of these various options to do both in-person, hybrid, and virtual instruction.
Thank you. We actually Worked our way into my next question, which is surrounding hybrid and remote learning. What would you all say are some benefits and challenges associated with hybrid and remote learning? Dr. Dixon.
Well, I think some of the benefits is something that I've always thought was important by teaching introduction classes, which I believe is the lifeline of any department. One thing that I'm able to do with the introduction courses, and I say it so that it's very clear that if there's an introduction class, an introduction course in anything that you may be an expert in, or a so-called expert, there's no way that you know everything about that book, that you know everything about that topic as an introduction class. So what it's allowed for me to do is to increase my use of what I call a guest speaker series. So because it's a bit more available to have people come into the classroom and give their thoughts. And these are folks that I would seek out for their expertise. So it permits for a wider range of speakers to become part of the conversation. Now, some of the challenges is you have to be very engaged with your students to have them keep their cameras on, because they naturally want to turn their cameras off. Now, whether you have to do it because you've earned the respect or you just continue to tell them, turn the camera on, turn the camera on, turn the camera on. However it works, something in between. But those challenges are something we haven't seen. So now, when we think about, students falling asleep in class, well, with the camera off, no matter what, I'm thinking, there is some kind of issue that leaves them without being engaged. So it calls upon you to be more savvy and to be more interested. But when I think about the good that comes of it, there is this shrinking of the world. There is this immediate response that I can give to them. There is something that they can give back to me that's as immediate, that allows for what my colleague was saying, to have this space to have talks about things that don't have anything to do with academics. So I think that I will continue to be challenged about how much of it do I incorporate into my repertoire now compared to last semester. So that means I need to be critically reflective all the time. So I think it does put me in a position to be more of a analyst about my own day-to-day rhythms. So I think that's helpful, particularly when I fall short. Not the things that I do well easily, but those things that challenge me.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. And Dr. Hippolyte, what are your thoughts?
I'd echo so many of those sentiments. I'd say that some of the benefits have been finding unique ways to build community, starting off class with like a song and seeing everyone kind of dancing to get class started in their own homes, in their own spaces, seeing family members that pop into the camera that I wouldn't see if we were in person. I've also tried to be really intentional about making sure that the space we create in our virtual setting is restorative because of everything that's happening. So we start with meditations, we end with written reflections, make it feel like when you are turning on the camera and turning on, opening all of your documents, that you feel a little bit of excitement, like this is going to be restorative in some way to be in this space and in community with one another. And I think, and I hope that will be just as easy, if not easier, once we're in person. But we all know that we're not just suddenly going from, the onset of a global pandemic and then to in person, and it doesn't exist anymore. There's still so much that we need to understand about what it will mean to be safe in person. Our students have families, they have elders that they're living with, they have young ones that they're caring for. And so while I'm excited to get back to being in person because I'm looking forward to just that in-person community building, I also want to be really conscious of this thing, this COVID-19 that we're still learning so much about. And we just hope and pray doesn't come back in the way that it started, but we just don't know. And so the benefit is of remote learning, hybrid instruction right now is that it gives us some flexibility to continue to be with one another, to support one another virtually. And we're still, looking forward to being in person and being able to connect in those ways that we're used to safely.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Hippolyte. And Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you both to my colleagues. They pretty much answered the question. However, I'll just add a few. When I think of the challenges, I like to start there. I think of the lack of engagement and sense of belonging that students may have or may feel. So, and I'm thinking more so if I'm coming to an academic course, and maybe that involves some type of group learning or group projects, and figuring out how to do that remotely can be a bit difficult because everyone's schedules may be different. When people are working from home, a lot of people are not just working from home. They have children, they have school, they need to cook, they need to clean. It's a lot, and setting a schedule is very important, right? Because typically you would leave the home and then you're working these hours, you take your lunch break. But when you are home, I think it blurs the line. And you have to create boundaries, and that's really hard to do. I'm very biased. My home is my sanctuary. So creating a space to work has been very difficult for me, and I've learned how to work that out. But I even recognize my privilege and able to do that. Some people cannot because the house is full. There's a lot of people. There's no quiet space. I definitely agree with Dr. Dixon with the cameras being off, but also understanding for some people they can't. They may not want to show because of what's happening back there. I mean, I'm sure we all saw all the social media craziness with the background that's happening, people walking past, and just a lot of things that people don't want to show. So I think those are the challenges. In terms of the benefits, as my colleagues already mentioned, the flexibility, the immediacy of holding space for students and people when these tragedies are happening. I've been able to hold space immediately for students, have support groups where they can just come and I can be a soundboard. Some come, some don't, but just to say, hey, I'm here this date and time, please come. That has been extremely helpful. As well as meeting with large groups of students and trainings for 300 people, trainings for 200 people. When we think about the DEI work, as Dr. Dixon mentioned earlier, it has afforded those opportunities and working opportunities for me and consultant opportunities for me to really be able to tap people in different states where otherwise I have to get on a plane, and travel and get to places. So it's definitely the positive and the negatives. I'd rather be in the building, as I mentioned, but I do think it affords positive benefits and, as we mentioned, challenges, and we just have to work around it for all of us to benefit. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thank you all for how you answer that question. And I think the question that is going to be on everybody's mind, how we're going to transition back, like you all have mentioned, to that face-to-face environment and where e-learning and hybrid is going to fall into that. But again, audience, if you are watching this lovely episode of Conversation Starters with our expert panelists, please feel free to like, share, comment, or ask any questions that you may have. They are more than happy to answer. So I know we mentioned a little bit, I heard someone mention, I think it was Dr. Johnson, about social media, which goes into my next question. What impact does social media have on the educational experience? Dr. Hippolyte, what are your thoughts?
I think social media has had an immense impact on the educational experience. For one of the courses I teach about technology, we talk a lot about the racialized algorithms of social media. So I also think that there's something to be said about media literacy. And we all know that there's a lot of fake news that's also kind of shared over and over again through social media. So making sure that part of what it means to experience higher education is to learn about how to navigate media sources. I think we have to, as part of the engagement conversation we've been having, tune into what platforms our particular students are using. So I've even found differences between, one cohort that I'm teaching and another, where it'll be mostly Facebook users versus TikTok users. And so being thoughtful and leaving enough space in your syllabus to invite some of that engagement through other platforms. I even think what's really interesting is how our students use the chat. So we usually use Zoom for our courses, and you'll find that it feels like live tweeting, just feeling like people want to find a way to connect with one another, even as they're taking in new content. And even though it's a bit more expansive than social media, I've also tried to think about how to move beyond just like traditional assigned readings and think about how we might have, threads from tweets that are really informative or foster a lot of critical dialogue, and how that can be a part of our assignments and our conversation starters, particularly for thinking about current events. Using podcasts has been something my students have really loved, because they said they're just tired of looking at screens. And so they find, I can work out and be listening to this podcast and feel like I'm making progress on the millions of things on my to-do list as a student and as a professional. And so for me, social media personally is really important in terms of how I'm able to communicate with my community, especially during COVID, not being able to see people like I would in person. And like what my colleagues have said about being able to engage scholars from around the country on various topics, bring them into class, make them a part of our conversation, because of this opportunity we have in strengthening our virtual capabilities. So I think there's so much promise for social media. And I think it's also important that we have really critical skill building efforts towards helping our students understand what is healthy use of social media, balance. How do you determine what is a credible source through social media, as we've been doing with traditional forms of literacy for decades, and thinking more creatively about how to bring it into the classroom.
Thank you, Dr. Herpelin. And Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts? I think you're muted.
We can see everything. Dr. Dixon mentioned that earlier. We can see the good and we can see the tragic. I also think social media desensitizes us to traumatic events that are happening throughout the world. People are literally seeing people being murdered on social media. I can't even watch those things. I feel like organizations sometimes maybe feel pulled to make sure they have presence on all the different platforms, because they are out there. So you have to pay attention to what your customer or where your customer is. But a lot of times our students are all over. So you need the TikTok and the Instagram and the Facebook and all of the others. It's a lot to maintain. I feel like social media is extremely addictive. How do you take a break? How do you self-care? When do you cut it off? A lot of times the students find out things before I do because they're on social media and I took a break, so it's really, again, ends of the spectrum. It's hugely impacting higher ed. I also love that it allows me to connect with other scholars of color. There's so many different groups that people are attached to and organizations out there across the world that I probably wouldn't even known if it wasn't social media. So that's a positive there. I love what my colleague just mentioned regarding the audios and the podcast. You find out a lot of scholars of color have podcasts or other educators that you can listen to get your glass full, as I like to say. So that's important. It also made me think of the Slack and GroupMe. That's another platform students are using to engage. It's so much. I can't keep up. I really need a social media manager. I need a young person. I can't keep up. But those of you who can, my colleagues who can, great job. But it's a lot. And it's really in higher ed. I mean, again, 10 o'clock at night, I'm finding out something's happening, and then I got to make a decision. Do I send that email, or do I draft it up to go out at 8 a.m., or do I send it right now to my dean because I just found out about it? That's what I'm dealing with. So now I have to make a decision. That's very difficult at 10 o'clock at night when I just want to brew, have a good time on social media, but then I get hit with something. So it's really impacting higher ed and conversations and how we communicate with one another instantly, and making a decision to self-care first and then deal with the tragic things in the morning.
No, thank you for that. Dr. Dixon.
I want to thank my colleagues because they did a great job laying it out. I want to go from theory to practicality. So February 18th, we provided at the Black Studies Center, University of Wyoming Black Studies Center, we provided one part of a 3-part film series. It was called Cinematic Realism and Racist Propaganda. And the first installment was Birth of a Nation, 1915. But I want to take a step back, which should give us some way to pull it all together. We reckoned with, in an intentional way, the death of Black Wall Street for our overarching theme. So to show the power of cinematic realism, the very first film was Birth of a Nation. And if you're familiar with Birth of a Nation, it is one of the most, if not the most, impactful movies in American cinema history for more than one reason. The very first motion picture. Also, it brings about this realism that we still see that's alive today. But the idea of learning how that particular time, 1915, and the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and his endorsement of this leads to the death of Black Wall Street. That's the backdrop. So when part 2 was called, it was a documentary called Before They Die. You might want to write that down. That's a great documentary. Before They Die is about the survivors, told from the lens of the survivors of Black Wall Street. And we had Attorney Dimenzio, who is representing some of the survivors. And he was giving his thoughts about this documentary, which he was in. And all of a sudden, we were Zoom bombed. And the Zoom bomb started off with pornographic material. And then it went to, the N-word. And the most horrific, disrespectful display of free speech that I'd witnessed. And I believe I've seen some pretty terrible things. But not just social media, but what comes from social media is this rising of old thoughts. This rising of, let me use the Mohawk Conference of 1890 and the Negro question. What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Right? Using it as a backdrop, when this started, this Zoom bombing started, literally this was because of the work that we had been doing and the conversations that we were having that were challenging the mainstream narrative. Now, higher ed and First Amendment rights can be used in a very appropriate way, and they can be used in ways that are tied to very nefarious thoughts. So what came out of this was a big deal about Zoom bombing and hate bombing and things of that nature. But what came out of this was my institution immediately said, well, hold it. These folks were not from the university. So we saw the response of the institution. There was a group of folks that said, well, that was the most terrible thing that I've ever seen. And that was a portion. There was also a group of folks who remained completely neutral. And there was also a group of folks that, you know what, you guys deserve that for having these conversations. So the vestiges of social media and what becomes these lines of reasoning tie all particularly to white supremacy and white privilege. So that was what came of that, particularly when we talk about something practical, moving from theory. This is what happened. And we were contacted from all over the country. Many folks wanted to talk about it. But the idea was that some folks really believed that we were in need of that kind of behavior from other groups of people who felt like we had gone too far. So it's a reflection of many of the paradigms that have backed America from its very onset. So it reflects it in direct and specific ways. And that was just one way that I wanted to be able to have folks understand that when we talk about social media and the vestiges and how accurate and awkward those veins are, that you will see them time and time again. And a lot of times they're not documented. Well, this was documented. So we had a town hall meeting about it with the president of the university. Nothing came of it because it's way too serious to have the conversation about that in a relative and culturally responsive manner. So social media in itself has its vestiges. And some of those vestiges, when you see them in a practical manner, reflect attitudes, actions, and behaviors of those who really believe that there is privilege for them and no privilege for others. And an attitude is always an orientation into one's mind.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Dixon, for providing that historical context, wonderfully put on social media. Greatly appreciate that. So the next question that I have for you all is, what is the role of academic leadership in developing policies responsive to an evolving academic landscape? Dr. Hipperlin.
Well, what a question. So I think this question makes me think about my first response about the future of higher ed and the influence of capitalism and privatization on higher ed. So I think the last example about the Zoom bombing is actually a really great one to transition into our understandings of institutional leaders and their responses to what happens on their college campus. I'd say that in the last year or so, we've seen a whole host of responses from organizations, college presidents, deans, provosts, in response sometimes to what happens in a local election, trying to make sure that the unrest is controlled. Sometimes in response to the murders of Black children, Black people. Again, often it feels like to quell the anger and the frustration that so many communities are feeling by over policing. And I think that in terms of higher ed, we haven't seen many examples of academic leaders who are really willing to say when something is unacceptable. And then even fewer examples of leaders who are willing to take action to support their Black students in particular, their racially minoritized students, their low socioeconomic students, or first generation students. And we know the many, many students who share all of those identities and are most impacted by our university structure, given the history that it was not created for them. So I think that there's a lot of promise and opportunity for a new wave of leaders to come into higher ed spaces and do something differently that we haven't seen before, that is not responsible to only the boards, the donors, but actually being thoughtful about how to best serve their students and families and local communities. I mean, we can also talk about how many of our universities are located in areas where they take and don't give back to the families and the communities around them. In many cases, push them out and make it financially impossible for families to stay in that area through gentrification. So I think that there's a big role and responsibility for academic leadership when we think about what we want to envision the future of higher ed to be. But unfortunately, it's feeling really challenging to see leadership that feels impactful and responsive to the day-to-day needs of our students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hippele. Dr. Dixon, what are your thoughts?
Well said by my colleague. Well said. Academic leadership. Let us never forget that a lot of times academic leaderships, particularly those very high-ranking positions in academic leadership, are not supported by tenure. Let's just be clear that that's not the optics. That is the fundamental principle. So when I think about those who have the most access to what we call the central zone of power in academic leadership, there is a list of expectations that are not necessarily on their job responsibility that are not only expected but demanded from a lot of those professionals. So I don't want to keep harping on it, but I do want to talk about it. And this is not a broad sweeping paradigm shift or accusation, but I think that when it comes to academic leadership, particularly in what I've known, when it comes to those things that are supposed to represent diversity and inclusion, and those things that are supposed to represent equity and social justice, I think that for the most part, it continues to evolve in this springboard for what the ruling regime says is important. So I become very critical about that. So critical that I have learned a term that I continue to advance: social justice racist. So what I mean by a social justice racist is someone who would have the power over creating, let's say, a mandatory training for diversity. And you look back with a critical enough eye and you find that they have this laundry list of being racist themselves. So the manipulation of academic leadership is nothing new. I think what we're seeing now is business as usual and par for the course, because now it has this look of color. It has this look of acceptance because of who it is. So when we see these professionals and they have these great backgrounds, and yeah, they come from some of the most qualified backgrounds, and you have these experiences with them. Give you guys an example. I just recently sat on the inclusivity pillar, which was one of 4 different pillars. And these folks who are educated at the highest heights of Eurocentric education came to the table by saying that we should create a white paper. And this white paper will be representative of how this institution will move about diversity, equity, inclusion. Number one, I got to tell you, very monolithic at the University of Wyoming. How about this? Monochromatic at the University of Wyoming. But the folks who were leading these efforts have led efforts before and have come up short. So if the ruling regime understands this and continues to send them in as leaders, then that says a lot about the outcomes. And those who control the parameters will control the outcomes. So when I think about academic leadership and academic landscape, I think that a critical critique is very much so needed. And it has to come from those folks who are willing to part ways, or at least put in a very precarious situation their ability to be able to hoard culture, material culture, because you will be charged for, and many folks say speaking truth to power. But if you're honest, and if you're candid, and if you're forthright and academically and empirically correct, we find that there are ways that the academic leadership has to justify their decisions. And here's the problem. It's okay to make a decision for someone in higher or upper academic leadership, but they don't like the critique that comes behind it. So it's hypocrisy in many ways. And also, when we think about academic leadership, I want to go back to how I started. They don't have the protection of tenure. Plus, there is not too many vice presidents on any of these campuses around this country that's satisfied with being the vice president. That is not their goal. So I think when we look at academic leadership, it is one of the ways that had continued to create these spaces where they have less than forthright way of dealing with these problems that continue to pile and continue to become, well, now what we talked about with modernity is these things are now being discussed in public. So there is this sort of way to hold folks accountable. But no matter how accountable we hold people right now, academic leadership is going to go right back to those goals that they created as soon as this, even while this conversation is going on. So I think lots of time with academic leadership comes a hypocrisy. It comes with this set of equations that allow for justifications. And I think even when, as what the elders would say, when you have empirical truth, it doesn't mean you have the right to win for that day. So it's systemic, and in itself, it needs to make sure that we understand that, you know, there will be some who challenge. Not many, but there will be some that challenge.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Wonderful conceptualization of that question. Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. I'm absolutely hands down to my colleagues. Thank you so much for providing your input. When I'm thinking about this question, and as Dr. Dixon was speaking, it definitely had me thinking in the direction of when we're thinking of academic leadership, thinking about where we are right now, locally, wherever you all are, because I'm not even sure where you are, but locally and nationally, we are in the space to disrupt and dismantle systems of oppression. I think that is the goal from people who look like me, people who believe in social justice, all the DEI, all the good stuff Dr. Dixon mentioned, right? That people can say so easily off the tongue. But what does it really look like when we think of academic leadership and moving and shifting a culture of an institution? When we already started this conversation highlighting that higher education is slow in many things and many facets. So I'm thinking about this question and really saying, how are academic leadership, how are they really creating a brave space, an inclusive space to hire in people who think differently than they do? Really being open and welcoming to a new perspective, a new idea, which is going to drive the shift of power dynamics. Someone has to relinquish some power and or share it. And who is willing to do that? And I think that's why it brings us back to we're still fighting all these years, because people, those in administration at the high level, they're just not willing to give up their seat. I want to say more, but I'm trying to use my words precisely here, you know, and this is causing our students pushing, fighting. You know, I love this generation. They are pushing, they're loud, they are fighting, you know, for a shift and a change. They can't do it alone. So their fight is in my opinion, doing their best to shift the administration, the leadership, so we can hire those who are really here to dismantle the systems of oppression, which is very difficult because when they are hired, they're one person for a whole department. How does that even work? Doesn't make sense. So now you have to pull on your allies, that's the term I'm using for this conversation, to assist you with pushing and moving this power dynamics to get funding to do what you really need to do. Because a lot of times when we hire people in these positions, there's no budget. There's a miracle that people somehow want you to do in making shifting culture. And it takes training, it takes resources, especially when we are thinking of assisting our students of color and really giving them a space, a brave space where they feel included, they feel welcome, and we're providing an educational experience for them. Oh, that's a heavy question. So when I think of, really quick, one more comment. I'm sorry, my thoughts all over. When I think of this question and how we're responding and evolving academic landscape, it also makes me think of how institutions are responding to what's happening. I mentioned earlier the tragedies that's happening across the world, police brutality, murdering of students and people in marginalized groups. How is the university responding? Who's sending out the statement? Is it the president? Is it the dean? Who's waiting for who? How long is it taking for it to go out? All of those things are so important. All of those things are essential to do immediately to really show that an institution cares. Students understand and know when an institution doesn't care. Students understand where this is just politics. They don't care about politics. They want to care that they are seen and that they are heard, and what is the institution is going to do to protect them. So this question is huge, and it's a lot of different things to consider and think about. So when we see the different ways that institutions are responding, many times they're not focusing on the lives that were lost and the impact that it's causing to the community, whether it's on the campus or locally. Sometimes they're focusing politically, and we don't all agree politically. That's why we're here today, in these different differences of opinion and perspectives and lived experiences, right? And disproportionate lived experiences. That's why we think the way that we do. So anyhow, I really think it calls for a shift in administration. Those like me, and I'm sure my colleagues on the call who will speak up, who will drive and push, but even sometimes we're limited. We're stopped because we're not there yet, or someone putting the cap on the bottle for us. So I just think this is a really tough, a tough way for us to navigate this system. We have to keep pushing. We will keep pushing, of course, but what could really change today always seems to take 5 years later because we're not in the positions of power to make change immediately.
And before we go further, hold it a second. I appreciate that. And I wanted to just inject after her thoughts because she nailed it. Sister nailed it. But what I want to talk about is something very specific. When we talk about allyship, that was just mentioned. The understanding a lot of times in diversity, equity, and inclusion and in social justice advocacy is that white allyship means to lead. That's problematic. White allyship means to set the pace. That's problematic. White allyship means to control the funding. That's problematic. So when we think about how academic leadership is indeed implicit in concretizing the status quo, then we need to be straightforward about that. What I mean about that is it's very easy to have someone over a Black Lives Matter movement who isn't Black, because it's something about that social justice racist that's in their psycho-viscera that allows for them to say, yes, I need to be leading this population. See, that's the problem. Anything else that you see is being played out. It's the connection that comes from their mind. And Bobby Wright, he calls it menticide. You guys should put that in the chat somewhere. Dr. Bobby E. Wright's menticide. Dr. Bobby E. Wright's menticide. Well, you think your friend's your enemy and your enemy is your friend. So if we understand that this is set up and supported, what you ignore, you empower. So for me to have this white anthropologist who's over the Black Lives Matter, and he believes that that's the way it should be, and then ask for me to help him and assist him. Well, one thing he's got to understand, the most revolutionary thing I can do is remove myself from an oppressive system, from an oppressive situation. So right before we had one of our public forums, he retired, because the public forum was called Allyship, White Privilege, and Social Justice Racism. See, it wasn't the fact that what he did up until this point. It was the fact that the critique was coming. And the critique was going to be very heavy-handed. It was going to be direct. And it was going to be aimed at him and his colleagues. But that doesn't change the fact that Social Justice Research Center on the campus of University of Wyoming controls the purse strings. So where do we go? Where do we look to having this, if you will, even playing field? Well, it's never going to be even. So I was always taught, like many folks are not. I wasn't taught just to seek a job. I was taught to create a job.
Absolutely.
No, thank you, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Dixon, for that, Dr. Hippolyte, for your comments. I mean, we have so many comments that were coming in during you all as you were talking, and everyone is loving this conversation. I mean, this is just everyone, if you're not watching, if you have friends, families, just, share this episode with them. We're having a wonderful conversation this evening about modernization and higher education. I want to just thank you all for your insight, your expert conceptualization on this topic, and helping the audience members to really understand what this looks like. So thank you very much. But before we go, I have one more question to ask all of you. How has your affiliation with the Black Doctoral Network helped to enhance you personally and or professionally? Dr. Johnson.
I would say my connection with BDN has been exceptional. I've had the opportunity to connect with colleagues that look like me, feels so good, in a space where we can really fill each other up, affirm one another. And I still have relationships and build great relationships with my colleagues across the world, really. And it's because of BDN. I joined when I was going through my doctoral program, and 3 years out, I'm still connected to the organization. It really provides a safe space, a brave space, and a safe space for us to come together and think intellectually, challenge one another, and give us the tools and best practices to bring back to our institutions and how we navigate different spaces. So it's a total 100% supportive network, and please join it if you have not already.
No, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your membership, and Dr. Hippolyte.
So for me, I mean, so many of the similar reasons that I've experienced, just professionally, personally feeling validated in so many of the spaces that are created. I think there was also, as a member formerly as a doctoral student, there was so much informal ways of knowing and ways of being that I think had been kept secret in a lot of white spaces. And so it was so beautiful to have a professional social space to be able to share those insights and feel like you could get that advice from others who were in the pipeline of being able to share a lot of those insights. So forever grateful and still learning from so many members.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Dixon.
Well, I think the one thing that BDN has allowed for me to do is to continue my services outside of the classroom. So I've worked with many organizations, including Dr. Carter G. Woodson's ASALA organization and the National Council on Black Studies, which are the major fields. And now there's an additional prong to that group, and that's the African American Intellectual Historical Association. So these are history in their backdrop, which is what I do as a historian. But it's good to have this access to BDN. Now I work with the conference coordinating committee, which I love to do as service. So I want to go back to that service. It has allowed me to continue service for those populations that we are directly responsible for. And it's outside of just a historical thing. Now, my wish for BDN is that we continue to train future scholars, future doctorates that will have this understanding in a very straightforward way of their responsibility to their community, like what they owe their community and what it is that will be challenging about being responsible for your community. So I use the word potential because BDN has the potential to be that on-ramp when we think about connecting the campus and all the things that we do as Black doctors in the community. I think it's very apparent that there's a big difference between being a doctor and a PhD. Being a PhD means that you have somewhere along the line passed enough classes that have in many ways tied to the most highest level of Eurocentric training that one can have. But being a doctor kind of definitely denotes and asserts that you have this connection to what can heal the Black community. So Black Doctoral Network can represent an on-ramp to healing some of those things in the Black community that are made for the academic and the intellectual to deal with directly in a way where there's service involved. So you think about the difference on many things, but one of the things we think about how many brilliant Black economists we have that are doctors. And then we think about the plight of the Black economy. And then we think about the Black perspective when it comes to psychology, and we think of the plight of the Black psyche. We think of Black sociologists with PhDs, and then we think of the plight of the Black society. I think that we need to, at this point, go back, readjust our thoughts, and the Black Doctoral Network seems to be one of the most obvious spaces that this can happen. Well, ASALH's been around since 1915, and if I'm not mistaken, this is year number 47 for National Council on Black Studies. So it's indeed imperative. So I think that Black Doctoral Network has its work cut out for them, but I do believe that it has the proclivity for the potential to directly address some of those ills.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. And again, thank you for your contributions and your ongoing service as being a member of the Black Doctoral Network. Well, before we go, I'm sure the audience members would love to follow up with you with any questions that they may have. So I would ask you all just to provide some of your contact information before we go. Dr. Johnson, how can audience get in contact with you?
Please contact me through my email, which is info@mentorfirstgen.org. You can follow me on Instagram as well as Facebook at Mentor First Gen Incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dixon, how can we get in contact with you?
I can be contacted directly at fdixon@uwio.edu. And as you see, you can make sure that you are able to connect with University of Wyoming Black Studies Center, easy to get in touch with. And in the future, particularly July 2nd, we will be hosting a mini symposium that centers the questions that were posed by Frederick Douglass in his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. I see my dear sisters in Rochester. That's where it took place. It took place in Rochester, New York, July 5th, 1852, right around 6 p.m. So if we understand that it's time to revisit that, our title is "What to the Slave's Children is the 4th of July." So feel free to contact us and join us. And we look forward to continuing these programmatic efforts. And thank you to BDN for allowing for this conversation, which I want to say to my colleagues and for our moderator. This was a great piece. Excellent. And I'm thankful that I was able to join.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Hippolyte, how can we get in contact with you?
Thanks so much. So feel free to email me at lihippolyte@cpp.edu. You can also visit my website, leannahippolyte.com, to learn more about the research and teaching that I do.
Wonderful. I mean, I'm speechless. This is beyond the most insightful and relatively, I would say, practical and realistic conversation that we've had in a while, because I think when you hear the topic, modernization of higher education, it just flies over your head for some people. So I really appreciate your expertise this evening and sharing with all our audience members and educating them on how this all works. So again, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
So before we go, if you have enjoyed Conversation Starters and would like to keep up to date with the latest BDN developments, please be sure to check us out on blackphdnetwork.org and become a member, and follow us on Facebook at Black Doctoral Network. Please be sure to share this live session with your friends, families, and colleagues, and your professional networks. I'm your moderator, Fessé Longe, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good evening.